Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Camp Run Amok Facebook page or the Portland Cocktail Week YouTube channel if you're watching there. We are going to embark on our third class in our ABCs of Canadian Whiskey series today. I am Britany Leach Johnson, and today I am once again joined by the beautiful and talented Gina Fossitt, who's the Trade and Education Brand Manager for Corby Canadian Whiskies, and Dave Mitton, who is the Global Brand Ambassador for Corby Canadian Whiskies. I feel like this is the moment we've all been waiting for, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the class, but I feel like we've repeated what is coming this week several times over the past two classes, so I think you know what's coming your way. But today we're going to talk about maturation. Canadian whiskey can be aged in any type of wood, and the aging environment directly affects the flavor of whiskey. These factors combined lead to endless flavor possibilities. Flavor with a U. Dave and Gina are going to break down the complexities of wood influence, diffusion, and terroir. You'll get an inside perspective on how each decision in the aging process can lead to an expression becoming someone's favorite Canadian whiskey. So there's a lot to cover once again, but first, there are 4 things I'd like for you to do. Like us here on Facebook. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We love that. Follow us on Instagram. And comment below and ask questions. Keep in mind that if you have questions specific to maturation, today is the day. It's your time to shine. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Gina so we can finally get to the bottom of the mysteries of aging Canadian whiskey.
Thank you, Britany, and great to be back. Week 3 of the ABC's certification course. So excited that we're doing the Wednesday classes live. So we encourage everyone to participate, ask questions. And for our 100 students, the same goes, but keep in mind, Gina is going to walk you through an in-depth look today, but tomorrow's going to be a treat. I walked through Dr. Don's presentation with him. I lost count at about 65 slides, and he's gone more in depth than I've seen working with him for the last 8 years. We've shared with him how engaged you all have been, and we've shared the questions you've had. So he basically turned up the dial to an 11 or a 12 with what he's going to share with you tomorrow. So you're going to get a first look at some things that he's never even spoken about with other whiskey clubs and bartenders around the world. I'm really excited. I'll stop talking now. I'll be back to taste some whiskeys, and I'm going to let Gina take control of the show.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Like Dave said, we're going to dive into maturation today. And, we are diving in. We're not just doing an overview here. We are diving into some specifics. But if you are one of the 100 certification students, like he said, keep in mind that Dr. Don is coming on tomorrow. And every one of these topics that I am talking about, Dr. Don is going much, much deeper, layers upon layers deeper. So, if ask the questions, bring them our way, but there's some that we are definitely going to save for Don tomorrow. With that, let's dive in. Maturation, here we go. Like we talked about in the previous weeks, especially last week, we're using Hiram Walker as our example. That's the distillery that the whiskeys that Dave and I work for are made at, and it's a wonderfully historical distillery, but also a massive production site that has many different distillation styles, lots of whiskey aging in the warehouses, and a lot of different styles to show you what's happening throughout Canada, really. So it really gives us a good view of Canadian whiskey in general. With that said, we're going to look at the warehouses at Hiram Walker called the Pike Creek warehouses. Now, these warehouses are located about 20 minutes north of the distillery. And there is a little creek that runs near there called Pike Creek. That's why they are named that. It is not our water source. There are 16 warehouses. And they are holding over 1.6 million barrels. So again, showing you scope here. They are palletized and stacked 6 barrels high. And there's 600 barrels per row. And Don's going to break all that down tomorrow. Now you see all that rust on the rings there, on those barrel rings. You're typically not going to see that in a lot of warehouses. You'll see, that warehouses can get older, and whiskey looks like it's been sitting there a while, but we really see a lot of rust forming on the outside. And that's because there's no temperature control in the warehouses at Pike Creek. So that means, Dave touched on this last week a bit, but we're really going to get into this subject today, the temperature fluctuations. So remember, we're sitting in Windsor, Ontario, right on the Great Lakes watershed. Those summers are as hot and humid as Louisville, with the Great Lakes, humidity and temperatures. And then in the winters, very, very cold winters, as low as -40 some winters, right? So major temperature fluctuations. And I pointed out the rust on the outside of those rings. That's what we can see from that because we don't have temperature control in our warehouses. So there's a lot of condensation happening, forming a lot of rust on the outsides of those rings. That's not affecting our whiskey. That's just a visual to show us that change in temperature and the climate. But the whiskey on the inside of the barrel is really affected by that as well. And we're going to get into that later in the session today. Okay, so regulations. Let's just kind of take a little visit back to week 1 when we discussed our regulations. Remember, there's one category of Canadian whiskey titled Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, or rye whiskey. And it shall, and then we're skimming down the regulations, be aged in small wood for not less than 3 years. Okay, let's break that down a bit. Small wood, that means less than 700 liters in volume for barrel size. Now, here's some illustrations just to give you, an idea on barrel size. Typically at Hiram Walker, we're using between a 200 to 250 liter barrel for aging whiskey. And I would say most of your big producers are doing that as well. Not to say we're not using other barrels outside of that, but that's primarily, most of our whiskey would be aged in that size barrel. Aging whiskey in something as large as a 700 liter barrel, isn't going to give you a lot of wood influence, which might be something you're going for if you're aging in a barrel that large, because you're just not going to have enough surface area or contact with the wood, the whiskey isn't, to get a lot of influence out of that. The smaller the barrel, the more wood influence you can get from a barrel, depending on its history, the barrel's history. Okay, in Canada, you can use any type of wood like Britany mentioned. I'm going to show you a few examples of what's aging at Pike Creek. This is not an exhaustive list of what's in those warehouses, but a few examples just to give you some ideas and the innovation that's happening in Canada just in maturation alone. So the top 3 here, new white oak American barrels, once used bourbon casks, multiple use Canadian casks, meaning they've been used several times over and over. At Hiram Walker, this is really the majority of our whiskey is getting aged in these. One of these 3 barrels, or maybe a couple of them. But I'd say we use a lot of these 3 barrels. We also age whiskey in other types of barrels. Rum, we're going to taste one of those today. We've got some Hungarian oak in there. Red oak, which I've really noticed more of a bitter and tannic quality coming from the red oak, at least on my palate. We've got some Speyside single malt casks. Tequila, we've got some really interesting rye distillate that I've tasted, and actually did a workshop a few years ago with Dr. Don on rye whiskey, and we just brought a bunch of different 100% rye distillates to show, the range of rye whiskey and what it can taste like. And one of them was in a tequila barrel, super funky. And we noticed most people don't love it. Bartenders love it. That funkiness that the tequila really gives the rye was pretty cool. French oak we've got sitting down. This to me really imparts a lot of vanilla, but also kind of a silkier texture it gives the whiskey. Oloroso cask, giving some really nice fruit notes there. Pedro Jimenez, we've got some Madeira, port cask, red wine. We just had a Cabernet finished whiskey not too long ago, released in Canada. Peated quarter casks. So peated, smaller cask, right? Some Black Sea casks, seasoned oak. We've got inserts. We can do all kinds of things. Like I said, this is a lot, but it's not everything that's aging at Pike Creek, and certainly not everything that's being used across Canada. But just to give you like an idea of how whiskeys can really, vary in their flavor from the wood that they're aging in. All kinds of wood can be used. Okay, so dilution, touching back again to last week's session. Our single column distillation, we're diluting down to a 70%. Double column, it's coming out at 70%, and then we're diluting it down. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Double column distillation coming out of the still at 94, maybe a little higher sometimes, certainly not higher than 95. And then the pot distillation after the column distillation is coming off the still at 80%. Now, all of these are being diluted before going into the barrel. 58% for the single column and the pot distilled whiskeys, and 76% ABV. Why choose these numbers? A lot of producers, and there is definitely something to this, like science always plays a role. It's a huge part of our process, as you all know. Where is the point where you're getting the most bang for your buck, the most wood extracts, the most sulfur taken out of the whiskey? What are you wanting to happen there? But there's also something really notable, historically speaking, in that, when way back when proof, became really part of our vocabulary when we're talking about whiskey. And it really was, the alcoholic strength that, would ignite gunpowder. And it proved, right? It proved that the alcoholic strength of the liquid was high enough. That strength at the time was 57.06% ABV. Is it coincidence that our distillery chose 58% to make sure they were always at proof coming out of the barrel? I don't know. Just something notable and to think about, because these numbers were actually chosen a very long time ago, and we can ask Don tomorrow in our workshop with him when the distillery started diluting down to these percentages. Okay, so what happens? We bring the whiskey off a truck. Now this is in major fast forward here. It goes onto this conveyor belt sort of and gets depalletized. And then it's going to go through the system. It's going to be drained first. And how these barrels are drained at our drain and fill stations it's kind of like a gas station hose. It goes in, sucks everything out like a vacuum from the top, and the barrels keep moving down the line. Another hose goes in, fills them up with the next whiskey. They go right back on the truck, right back out to the warehouse. Now here's a barrel being hand filled, where when we have a smaller batch or something, that's maybe a one-time release or something that wouldn't go through the big system, we would hand fill those barrels specifically. Okay, now let's get into barrel influence. What is the barrel doing for us? Here's a couple of barrels being charred, right? Lots of fire. So what does charring do first? When we char a barrel, we're creating this layer of carbon on the inside, right? When you char a barrel, you see that it turns black or very dark color. And so when we're charring the barrel, there's a couple of things that are going to happen to the whiskey from that layer of carbon. One is that it's going to remove sulfur. So this layer of carbon sort of acts like a Brita filter. And it's going to remove anything that you don't want. Now, last week we talked about copper removing our sulfur, right? So remember, if we have a lot of copper in our distillation, 100% copper stills, for instance, we don't need as much char on the barrel to remove sulfur. Now, we might want that char for something else to impart into the whiskey or influence the whiskey in some way. But as far as removing sulfur, we don't need as much because the copper in the still is doing the job. If we have a still that is more stainless steel than copper, we might want a heavier char level then to remove more of those sulfur compounds and those sulfur notes. Now, also when we char the barrel, we're really caramelizing the compounds and the sugar molecules that are in the wood. So you're really caramelizing, breaking down hemicellulose, cellulose, lignin. You're breaking down these big chemical compounds that really are the structure of the wood. They're the structure of any plant fiber, made up of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Structure of the wood. If we're going to break that structure down from fire, we're going to have smaller compounds that result in flavor compounds that we've created and can now be imparted into the whiskey. Also, there's chemical reactions happening. Oak lactones are developing, also departing into the whiskey. This chart specifically is from Dr. Don and his dissertation. So I'm sure he's going to dive into this chart specifically tomorrow. Even more, but it's a really nice overview to look at char levels. So, you know, when we have brand new wood and we look at a 2 millimeter depth of char, which we would consider a number 3 char level in the US, you can see the wood extract, what is imparted into the whiskey, is actually much higher than a 4 millimeter depth of char, or a number 4 char level in the US. So you can see from that red line to the green line, there's actually, you're going to get more wood extract imparted into the whiskey. And if that's what you're looking for, then a number 3 level would be what you want. That's the most of the barrels that we have at Hiram Walker, when we buy them brand new, we get them at a 2 millimeter depth of char. You can also see bourbon barrels there once used. Still going to get some wood extract out. Not nearly as much, of course. They've been used once. And those multiple use barrels. Again, you're still going to get some wood extract whenever you use a barrel, but not quite as much. The other notable thing about this chart is you can see most of the wood extract is really being imparted in the first 200, 300 for the new barrels days, the 200 certainly. And then you're still getting wood extract imparted into the whiskey, but at a much slower rate. Okay, so through time, you'll still get more, you know, whatever that extract is, whether it's flavor or color, etc. But it's still being imparted just at a much slower rate. It's very intense at the beginning of the aging process. So let's break down cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin for a second. And we're going to look at them like a brick wall. And Dr. Don, you know, really uses this analogy a lot, and I think it's a wonderful analogy. So we're going to think of cellulose as the bricks. 40 to 50% of the wood is made up of cellulose, and these are very large dextrose units, excuse me. Next, we have the hemicellulose. So these are going to kind of be like our loose bricks. much smaller in size, about 15 to 25% of the wood makeup. And then the lignin is really what holds it all together, holds the hemicellulose, the cellulose, and really holds the structure of the wood together. 10 to 20% here on lignin. So now when we char the barrel and we heat it up and we break down these compounds, the flavor that's going to be imparted or comes to life are notes like caramel, toffee, dried fruit, vanilla, clove, bacon, leather. I can't go through them all quickly enough as they're going across the screen, but just to show you that different flavors are coming to life because these large chains or compounds have been broken down from the heat. Now, there's other influences in barrels as well. We look at tannins. I'm just going to touch on this because Dr. Dawn is really going to dive into these and their molecular structures tomorrow. But when we look at tannins, this is another influence from the barrel into our whiskey. If someone says, wow, this whiskey, I'm nosing the whiskey and it really smells tannic. It's odorless. It does on the palate, really show itself. It's got a bittering kind of quality. It's sort of tea-like. On my gums, it gets very astringent on my gums. Some people describe it as chalky, but there is a tannic quality that comes from the barrel specifically. Those oak lactones that we touched on are developed, right? This is where coconut's going to come to life, especially from American oak. French oak has less of your trans lactones, so you have more vanilla character coming through there. And then color is a barrel influence. Your whiskey comes out of the still clear, and the color is really coming from the barrel. And that's going to be dependent on a few things. How much time, of course, it's spending in the wood. We just saw that the wood extract chart. Over time, you're going to continue to get more and more type of wood. Of course, a brand new barrel versus something that's been used multiple times. A brand new barrel is going to have more to give to the whiskey. Has something else been in the wood before that already has coloring to it? That will influence the color. So lots of different variables here to affect color, flavor, mouthfeel, etc. Okay, now diffusion. What is diffusion? It is a fancy word, really a scientific word, for barrel finishing. We mostly talk about it as barrel finishing, but really diffusion, is the molecules of any liquid that's already in the wood coming to equilibrium when something else is introduced to the barrel, i.e. the whiskey, okay, or what's going to be the whiskey, a spirit, I should say. So we have this barrel here, and let's pretend that those little green dots are rum molecules. Let's use rum today as our example. So there was rum in this barrel previously, and they're all sitting in the wood. But when the spirit that will become our whiskey after aging, or whiskey that's already been aged, is introduced into this barrel, now the rum molecules have somewhere else to go. And they are naturally going to find equilibrium and disperse themselves equally amongst the wood and the whiskey. So different flavors that we would get from different finishing barrels. If you got a sherry barrel, you might get more walnuts and raisins, some dates. Port's going to give you those nice fruity with a bit of spice to it and like dark chocolate notes. Rum's going to give you some nice island spices, that brown sugar, caramelized sugar notes. Bourbon, which we use a lot of at Hiram Walker, some dried fruit notes, caramel, vanilla. So depending on what you're finishing your whiskey in is really going to affect the final flavor of that whiskey, of course. Now we're going to go back to Dr. Dawn's chart. It's important to know, we've looked at wood extract and it really happening in that the bulk of it, I should say, really happening in that first 200 to 300 days, right? And then it doesn't completely plateau, but it slows down quite a bit. Your diffusion, that equilibrium, is happening in the first 200 days. Almost all of it is happening in the first 200 days. So if you have someone who, thinks that a whiskey finished in a port barrel for 5 or 10 years has more port imparted into the whiskey, that's not actually true. The whiskey, the port itself, that liquid or those molecules, really came to equilibrium. But what is happening from that extra time past the 200 days is you're continuing to age and get wood influence into the whiskey. You're also concentrating the port because you have angel share, which is the evaporation of alcohol through time in the warehouses. And depending on your environment in the warehouse, depends on how much angel share you're going to have. I know Dave mentioned this last week, but it's important to note, with 1.6 million barrels aging, there's a 3% evaporation rate happening after the first year. That first year is, I think, much higher, actually, and then it's a 3% after that. But, at a 3% evaporation rate, we're losing 48,000 barrels of whiskey every year. It's crazy. So, like I said, with evaporation, the alcohol is kind of evaporating off, and now that, let's say, port is concentrating up. The flavor is concentrating more. So it seems like there might be more port, but actually some of the alcohol from our spirit has evaporated off. And finally, the discussion of terroir. Now, this is highly debated in the industry. We don't believe in terroir. We know that terroir exists. And here's why. Because we have proof in our warehouses. Windsor, Ontario, right on the Great Lakes watershed, on that Detroit River, right? Those drastic temperature fluctuations that we just talked about. Our barrels are breathing. They are expanding. They are contracting. Now, what happens when your barrels are expanding and contracting and there's more oxygen getting to the whiskey? It sets off a series of chemical reactions. Okay, so ethanol reacts with oxygen, and then it is a series of chemical reactions that happen down the line. And I think it's around 8 chemical reactions later, the end result is ethyl acetate. Okay, what does that mean, right? Why is that important? Well, ethyl acetate development happens in every warehouse where you're aging whiskey, but it depends on your climate or your terroir and your environment on how much is going to be produced. So if you have a more temperate climate, like Scotland, for instance, you might have less ethyl acetate development because the barrels aren't breathing as much. Whereas in Windsor, where we have these very highs and lows of temperature change, now our barrels are like expanding and contracting, and we're getting a lot of ethyl acetate development. You can see here in this chart how that's happening over time. This is it says ethyl acetate formation in DD. This is double column distilled corn whiskey. So the grain character for the most part has been stripped out. The yeast character for the most part has been stripped out, and we are left with a very light style whiskey. Nothing to cover up what's going to happen in maturation. Ethyl acetate development. And you can see the development in parts per million here through 20 years. In Scotland, this line would be, a lot more horizontal, I should say. Okay, so what the heck is ethyl acetate? Why is it important? we're going to get a green apple note. That's what that really relates to. That is the flavor that's being developed, a green apple note in your whiskeys. And this is something that, you know, we take a lot of pride in and show off in our whiskeys. And we're going to do that very, very soon. Speaking of, I'm going to pass it to Dave to taste through two of our whiskeys. One of them is revisiting a whiskey from last week, which is JP Weiser's 18-year-old. The other is Pike Creek. Both of these whiskeys are styles that Dave and I picked out specifically for this week because they're very relevant to the material that I just talked about. So, Dave, take us through some whiskeys, would you?
Thanks, Gina. As always, thank you. Isn't she great, folks? I mean, 2 years I've been doing this with her. I don't know what I'm going to do when I get back out on the road without Gina at my side all the time. But yes, as Gina mentioned, we're going to specifically speak to JP Weiser's 18 and Pike Creek today. Some of the reasoning around that is you can imagine when we've all of our expressions of Canadian whiskey. We've got certain ones that we'll focus on when it comes to grain. We have certain one when it focuses on blending. JP Weiser's 18 is a great example for focusing on what age does to a whiskey, and then Pike Creek, it's our story of maturation. So first whiskey, you've got your, oh, how do I do this? See, I'm the old guy trying to figure out the camera. Only 2 years of this and I'm still new. Your JP Weiser's 18, our students have the samples. That was a look at the bottle for anyone that might be out and about looking for it at stores. On that note, this is one of our expressions sold across Canada and the US, Europe and UK. It's in a lot of our markets around the world. So it's one of the ones that should be easier to find. It is a stunning 100% corn whiskey. And as we know from our last couple of weeks, traditional Canadian whiskey is soft corn with a little bit of rye. This is 100% corn. Column distilled once to strip away any harsh qualities. And then as Gina just mentioned, the second column distillation takes away a lot of the big grain and yeast characteristics. Aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks. And that emphasizes a lot of like autumn florals, rich caramel, vanilla. Not as intensely as new oak, but you still get some of those spices from this. Now, first look at it, it's kind of a deep amber, autumn amber. I always get like a lot of almost vanilla cedar off of this. Certainly some of those autumn florals, a little bit of pine, and definitely a lot of mature oak, being minimum 18 years in the ex-Canadian whiskey casks. First sip, I mean, it's extremely soft. I always say this could be the softest expression of whiskey that we produce. It's extremely smooth. It's heavy in that mature oak. I steal this tasting note from a woman in California from years ago. As Gina talking about the ethyl acetate that comes out in this, she described it as having a Granny Smith apple dipped in caramel. And I was like, that's pretty good. Like, that's what I get off of this. I'm not sure if you do. Everyone's going to nose and taste different things. But this is a perfect sipper on its own. I have had people in the past create me cocktails with it, which have been lovely. But being a lighter styled corn whiskey, it might not hold its own with Amaros, big vermouths, herbal liqueurs. Plus the price range. It's a little more expensive than some of our cocktail whiskeys. And this would be, I would think, more preferred neat or on the over ice. Sorry, I'm stumbling my words right now. Any thoughts or questions on this so far?
I will say, it being such a light style, and I know we mentioned this last week a little bit, you know, it's interesting to see some Americans really gravitate toward it because it's very different than like a very grain forward bourbon or something, you know, that we think of here in the US, at least, as a corn whiskey. It's so light that some people really gravitate toward it, and some people do the exact opposite. Like, it's not what I'm expecting with corn.
It's a great point, and it is something that Gina and I have noticed where she's bringing it up is there's just certain areas in the world, certain areas in the US, certain in Canada, where you'll go and people will absolutely love this, and they'll buy a bottle straight away and say, this is a beautiful, like, light sipping corn whiskey. And then there are others who are expected, when they hear corn, they're thinking of that maybe bigger bourbon style. So it might throw them off a little bit, but just to always remember, this is that light styled corn whiskey. As we age a lot of our light corn in ex-Canadian whiskey casks, this is just a beautiful way to show off that ethyl acetate, as Gina mentioned, that you won't always find in Scotch whiskeys or older bourbons because of the way they're made, opposed to this being such a light style.
Agreed.
Oh, here's Britany.
Gina, we're going to go back to you and your questions.
Okay.
You've got a few. But for the JQIs 18, someone asked, do you know what the oldest whiskey that goes into this particular blend is?
Great question. Obviously, the youngest is 18. I mean, we've asked Dawn before. You're not going to find much older than like 19 or 20-year-old probably blended into that. Or otherwise, it defeats the purpose, because they would save that for some of our rarer expressions that we release every so often.
Okay. And then one more on this product. Someone asked if you could remind them of the proof.
Oh, yes. Pardon me. It's 40% ABV, so 80 proof.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to pop out so we can get to our next whiskey, and then I'm sure I'll be back after that.
Amazing. Okay. So the next up, Pike Creek. See, though, the light's all messing that up, but that's a little bottle of Pike Creek. Also one of our expressions that you can find across the US, Canada, over in the UK and Europe, Australia. So this one's readily available wherever our products are sold. Now I'm really sounding like a marketing team. So Pike Creek, as we mentioned, it's a story of maturation. When Gina talked about those 1.6 million barrels, it is an area called Pike Creek, about 30-minute drive from the distillery. Obviously, we're not going to keep 16 warehouses and 1.6 million barrels of whiskey in the downtown core of Windsor, Ontario. That wouldn't be a wise decision. So this whiskey was named after the area, and we have a lot of fun with it, where it starts off as a traditional style Canadian whiskey with the majority amount of that soft double column distilled corn, a little bit of rye added to it, aged in the ex-Canadian whiskey casks, let's say for a minimum of 10 years. And you get a lot of those same notes, like the autumn florals, you get some baking spices from the rye. Now, afterwards, we have, at Hiram Walker & Sons Distillery, as we've discussed, we make lots of many different products. And, we produce some vodkas, gins, rums. So some of the rums that we make, we've got leftover barrels after we've had the barrels brought up from the Caribbean. We blend some rums, and then we've got the leftover casks. So this is a great way to use them, is taking Pike Creek and finishing it. The diffusion, as Gina taught you about, or barrel finishing, takes on a lot of the characteristics from the rum into this light styled whiskey with a little bit of baking spices. Now, looking at it, it's kind of a polished copper. I always get a little bit of honey, raisin, certainly a little bit of brown sugar, subtle hints of orange. You almost get a bit of that little light green apple too, because it is a 10-year-old corn whiskey. That ethyl acetate will shine through. Now, first sip, this is also one of our lighter styles. It's also extremely smooth. It's got some roundness with that little bit of rye added to it. It's probably the sweetest expression of whiskey that we do carry. I get lots of honeycomb, subtle hints of spices from that rye. I almost get a little bit of Christmas cake, like island spices, molasses. I mean, that's coming from the barrel finishing. This is perfect to sip on its own. It's almost dangerously easy to sip on its own. I might have a little bit of experience with that where it's dangerous. But also we love watching, Gina and I in particular, love watching things happen naturally. For instance, we don't believe in taking a brand and saying, this is what you need to do with this whiskey. I mean, we'll suggest like Lot 40 works great for old fashions for a specific reason, but we weren't sure what was going to happen with Pike Creek when we started really selling this 8 years ago. God, I've been doing this a long time. What we're seeing it in Canada. We're seeing a little bit of US. We're certainly seeing it over in UK and Europe on a smaller scale. But in the summer months, bartenders are taking this whiskey, and this makes sense. They're muddling up herbs and using fresh juices and, you know, some herbal liqueurs and lots of crushed ice. And they're doing tiki styled, like summer refreshing cocktails with this rum finished whiskey. Makes perfect sense. And then even right now, you know, I'm not out on the road, but I'm seeing my Instagram where I'm being tagged, and people are tagging it in dessert cocktails. In the winter, colder months, they're doing it, and they're using it for flips. They're doing it in coffee cocktails. And, you know, this soft, spicy rum finished whiskey works perfect in those after dinner drinks. We found, and we're happy to see that people are doing it naturally all over the world with it. And this one is 42 ABV, 84 proof if anyone asks. Apologies for getting on the first one. Any questions or thoughts on this? Or anything to add, Gina Fossitt, professor?
Excuse me, I'm sipping on my whiskey.
Exactly.
No, I think that was a really great description. And this, you know, like I said earlier, we really chose these two whiskeys specifically because they really drive home what we were talking about this week with maturation. You know, with JP Weiser's 18 driving home the ethyl acetate development. Like Dave said, it's used multiple use Canadian casks, so there's not a ton of like, you know, crazy wood extract going into this whiskey. It's really showing off that ethyl acetate development. And rounded out, of course, by some of the maturation qualities. And then Pike Creek, like Dave said, you know, really showing off the diffusion process. How something which was similar to the 18-year-olds, primarily that corn whiskey, it does have a little bit of rye, so the spice component is notched up a bit. But, you know, then really like turning it on its side and seeing how a whiskey can change flavor so much from diffusion and barrel finishing. So, yeah.
Well, other than talking about how they love to use it in dessert cocktails, love to use it in a zombie, we did have one question that was asked twice. So I feel like this is probably on everyone's mind. How long is the Pike Creek finished in the rum cask? And is it first blended and then finished, or are only certain distillates finished and then they're blended with unfinished distillates?
Dave,
Gina?
Go ahead. Okay, I'll take it. Who's answering? Yeah, so it's finished in the rum cask around 90 days. Give or take on where we're holding whiskey and how things are flowing at the distillery, but you know, 90 days, 100 days, somewhere around there. And you can taste how much rum influence is in this whiskey. So again, looking at that chart from Dr. Don, like that diffusion process is happening quite quickly here, right? The whiskeys are first aged separately for 10 years. So the rye is aged on its own. The corn is aged on its own. Then they are blended after the 10 years and then finished in the rum casks.
90 days. I saw someone else was asking it as you were answering. So I just want to make sure they got it.
It's important to say too, like Regina said, 90 to 100 days. Dr. Don will probably say this tomorrow. It's for production purposes. Like that's basically, it's just generally 90 to 100 days, and then it goes and gets drained and the whiskey is made.
Yeah. And also you got to match the flavor. You know, you don't know how much rum is in that wood.
Who am I to say, you know?
Who am I to say?
Probably leave it to Dr. Don. So, so someone asked, for the rum cask, are they first fill rum barrels, or are they seasoned with rum before the whiskey goes in?
Go ahead, Dave. I took the last one.
They are, yeah, they're coming up from the Caribbean with rums. We're emptying it to blend rums, and then we've got that afterwards. Now, the life of the barrel, I don't know where it came from before it was in that, before the rum went into it. Obviously, we use it, keep using it afterwards. That might be a good, Dr. Don might be able to go in a little deeper on that tomorrow.
I was going to say one more question about barrels, but that's a complete lie because there's an entire list of questions about barrels from before we got to the tasting part. And this one may be something that like is, you know, company secret, but are you primarily getting your bottle or your barrels when you're finishing things from sister companies in the Pernod Ricard portfolio, or are you branching out and getting them from other places?
It's, I mean, yes, there's many reasons. There's legal things. I mean, for these specific rums, no, they're not coming from a little place in Cuba that's owned by Pernod Ricard. We get that question quite a bit. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say that name in America. But we, no, not always sister. We've done things. So Pike Creek, Dawn has done quite a few expressions. We've done 21-year-old versions where it's finished in PX casks, PX sherry casks, Oloroso casks, European oak. One we finished in a Speyside. And for instance, it did come from a sister company. It came from Chivas, which is also Pernod Ricard. What was in it before? I don't know. And Dr. Don says he doesn't know. And if he does, he ain't telling me. So it's there, you know, the honest to God truth around it is if you want to, when you see a brand out there that's finished with another big brand, it comes down to a lot of legal things. It comes down to acquiring rights, money. Sometimes just easier to get a really nice cask to finish in, and you don't have to deal with any of that stuff.
All of the products you're pulling out of those casks are delicious. So yeah, wherever they come from is where they come from. I did think that when you were saying Speyside cask, I thought you were going to say space. And I was like, so you got a barrel from space? That's pretty cool. I was like, I've heard of it being put in a barrel and sent to space, but never the other way around. But it wouldn't surprise me, right?
We're working on that, Britany. Innovation. We're working on it. Let's not give away the farm yet. We're working on it.
It honestly would not surprise me with Amy and Dr. Don at the helm. I would not be shocked. I'd be impressed, but not shocked. And then one more question directly related to the Pike Creek before we kind of go back into the overall presentation. With the Pike Creek, what is the volume of production per year as opposed to the other brands that Hiram Walker is producing?
That's a great question. That's going to be one for Dr. Don to answer tomorrow because I am uncertain of that. I could perhaps guess, but I'm probably going to guess incorrectly. So let's talk to the boss tomorrow.
Well, Darian, you will see Dr. Don tomorrow, so make sure you save that one for him. And let's get into some of these other questions. Okay, so kind of going back to the beginning of the presentation or close to it, is there any conditioning done to the barrels between dumping them and filling them?
No. So when you saw those barrels going on that conveyor belt in the drain and fill line, literally when they go on, once they're depalletized and they start going through the belt, right? As soon as they start going through, they get to one station and stop. The hoses come in, suck it all out. The barrels move down to the next station. The hoses go in, put new whiskey in. I mean, literally feet away from where they just were. They go down, the bungs get put on, they get pounded in, they go back on the truck. I mean, that's for the large scale production bottlings. You know, of course, the smaller production stuff is all hand done, like we said, but also no seasoning. I mean, depending on what's happening there, you know.
So. They do, for instance, like if we were going live in the warehouses tomorrow, you'll see some area where perhaps a barrel has fallen apart or been damaged, and they have to keep that because you get audited on that. You need to account for everything. Sometimes if you go in and there's a leak, if there is a leak, it's not easy to find if it's amongst those rows of 6 pallets high and 600 deep. But when they do find, they'll bring those in and repair them. But as Gina said, for the most part, when you're flipping it for a lot of the base whiskeys, it's empty fill right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was something around last time I was there. There's always a ticker, in that room of how many barrels are getting emptied and how many are getting filled every day. And it's every time I'm there, it's like around 1,100-ish are coming in and getting dumped.
It's on average 1,300 every day in an 8-hour shift.
There we go. So 1,300, even more. And then 1,300 are getting filled and going directly back into the warehouse that same day. So it's a consistent 1.6 million barrels.
Well, thank God for the processes that you can automate, because you've kept us all in plenty of whiskey, and I know that all of that fine machinery you have has a lot to do with it. Okay, so this one is specifically related to the char levels of the barrels. So, and this is in the differences between the 4 millimeter char and the 2 millimeter char. So in the differences in the wood flavor imparting graph, are those differences present because the 4 millimeter char filters out the wood extract more than the 2 millimeter char? And have you all selected the 2 millimeter char as a reflection of the climate in Canada, since you don't thermal cycle your rick houses in the winter?
I'm going to give you an answer to this, and then I think we should also bring this up tomorrow with Dr. John. But, really the char level, as far as filtering out, we're not really looking at it as filtering out the wood extract. It's more filtering out sulfur notes and other harsh qualities, but the sulfur is the big one at this point after distillation. And as far as choosing the number 3 or the 2 millimeter char depth level for the most part of new barrels that come into Hiram Walker, that is very purposeful. And, one reason is because all of our stills are 100% copper. So we're already taking out a lot of sulfur. We want to get the most wood extract, that we can, that's appropriate for our whiskeys. And then, maybe have less time in wood and more wood extract in that time, because we can maximize our product, right? And our efficiency. But also there is a person at the distillery, her name is Laura, who her sole job is wood selections. She is, in conversations and has relationships with many, many different distilleries and suppliers of barrels, and she's constantly searching and talking with Don and Amy about whiskeys that they're creating, new innovations, etc., and what they think will be needed. Can we find that somewhere? How much of it can we find? Is this even worthwhile producing because we can't find enough wood to mature it in of this style, to get this specific flavor notes? So Laura's job is a really big one, and I think it's really fascinating. One time she came to Whiskey Fest here in Chicago, and it was really fun to just kind of go around the room and taste whiskey with her, because she's specifically tasting whiskey based on the wood components that are coming out in each whiskey. And so, she's not even looking at all of the other components. It was really cool. It was a really cool conversation.
10 out of 10 would love to attend a whiskey tasting with her. So if there's a list or anything, I would like to be added to that, like a wait list. So for any of the brands that are being made at Hiram Walker, are you using any toasting on those barrels prior to charring, or just doing the charring?
Well, we're not doing any of it ourselves. We're bringing it all in. And Dave might have more insight into this as well. As far as I know, there's not a whole lot of toasted barrels, certainly being used in some capacities, but not a lot of toasted, mostly charred.
If
Dave?
And Don might correct us on this. Last October, I did an event, a virtual event in the UK, and it was toasted. I was asked, pardon me, to do toasted versus char. And I had to respond. I'm like, we don't have any toasted. So there wasn't a whole, I was like, I can come on and speak about char and everything we do in levels, but I was like, we don't do toasting. So I couldn't do any comparisons. So unless Dr. Don, something's changed in the last few months, we just have char. But we'll double check with him tomorrow. He's always got something new happening.
Well, and if he's toasting that barrel from space, he probably won't be able to tell us now. So we'll just have to keep our eyes peeled to see when that hits the market.
Yeah, that's about right.
All right. So we got a couple more, and if we hit time, we can definitely give these questions to Dave and Gina so they can get us some answers from Dr. Don tomorrow. But going more towards the overall time that products are spending in the barrel and Angel share, how often are the barrels checked to see like what percentage has gone, and are they ever cannibalized to top off other barrels?
That is a question for Dr. Don, I believe, unless Dave, you have an answer. I don't know how often they're checked, to be quite honest.
Definitely a Dr. Don question, but yeah, you got to think it says 1.6 million barrels, so they're not daily rotating them by any means, but it is a fantastic question. I have a theory, but I'm going to say let's wait for Dr. Don so I don't give anyone a wrong answer.
I honestly think I've done enough in the Dr. Don conspiracy theory department today, so maybe we just let him answer that one for sure, because he's going to walk into the workshop tomorrow and everybody's going to be like, where's our space whiskey? And he's going to leave. Why are you asking me that? And this question from Darian. So couldn't the oxidation over time, in addition to the volume reduction and thus concentration, affect the flavor, especially with like a port, which is an almost oxidized flavor anyway? And then Darian, because Darian is Darian, followed up with, I wonder how that could be studied, which I feel like is one of my favorite personality traits of hers. She's a science brain, and I love that about her.
Definitely affects the flavor through time, because you're concentrating up different flavor notes and compounds, and how much that barrel port was in that barrel to begin with, right? So yes, and it can be measured, and we will let Dr. Don talk about that in week 4.
Yeah, a great example of that, and it's something that we don't get to talk about often because it was a really rare expression we put out years ago. I'm even trying to remember if you were with us at that point when we did the Union 52.
I had just started.
Yeah. So long story short, well, none of my stories are short, but I had asked Don once, this is when I was pretty new, and I said, hey, like, do you ever find like lost barrels in the distillery amongst everything? And he's Don. He'll scientific tomorrow. He goes, no. He's like, we're audited twice a year, like every distillery. He goes, that's a marketing ploy. No one loses barrels. I was like, okay. I was like, so you've taken the romance out of it, but, and he said, I have a list as long as my arm of things left over from previous blenders, distillers, something they didn't know what to do with. And I said, for example, what? And he said, well, he's like, we have 18 barrels of a 50-year-old Scotch. And I was like, what? Why do we have 50 barrels of a 50 old Scotch? And he said 50 years ago, they might have been using it for the 9.09 rule, like to blend into a whiskey. I'm like, okay, got ya. I said, what are you going to do with it? He's like, I don't know. 2 years later, he says to me, he goes, hey, remember the 18 barrels of Scotch? I'm like, oh yeah. I was like, how old is that now? 52 years old now. They took the 18 barrels of drain and fill and got 1 barrel. So in 52 years, 17 barrels, the Angels drank. And what he ended up doing with that was the story of Scotland, helping Canada coming over to make whiskey. He took a 15-year-old corn whiskey and he used the 9.09 rule and blended in that Scotch because A, it was unpalatable after 50 years, And it was a barrel. There wasn't enough to do anything. We couldn't call it Scotch. So they called it the Union 52 of Canada and Scotland, with the 52-year-old Scotch in there.
I knew when you started this story it was going to be good, because I could just see Gina when she's like, yes, I just started, like reflecting back on it.
It's also like one of my favorite whiskeys Don's ever put out, and we hear it from people all the time, and it's never being made again, because unless we come across a 52-year-old Scotch sitting in our distillery, it's not going to happen again.
That was perfect timing, because someone said, can you still find it?
I never got a bottle. I was so new.
The only thing I could say now is for instance, I have a bottle and a half. I have half a bottle in my whiskey collection, and I know there's one in my storage locker.
So you mean you have half a bottle and you're going to be giving that up? He didn't
But
get
one. I have heard, generally our expressions of whiskey up until the last few years, you don't see them like being auctioned off, but I've seen a few of our whiskeys for sale online in Union 52. If somebody wanted to search it, you might be able to find it. But no, we made it 5-6 years ago, and it was one run. That was it. It was a few thousand bottles, and it pretty much sold out overnight.
Well, if you run out to it out in the wild, then you get it.
Yeah.
So make sure you pick that up. So we do have a couple of other questions, but I think some of these are going to be like Dr. Don is going to answer them. So Dave, Gina, if it's okay with you, these are particularly from our certification students. So I'll take those and send them over. But we did have one fun question. Well, it was actually two questions from two different people, but I think it ties into one really nice one to end the session today. When are we going to get close-ups of each of your bookshelves so that we can collectively add to our reading list? Which brings me to the other question. Does Dr. Don have any books that people can read?
Well, I have one of them right here beside me. But you're going to see these, and I have another one back here somewhere. You're going to see Dr. Don's books, and Dave, if you're in the certification program, Dave shared this in the first workshop. A lot of good resources that we have, but what we should do probably is post some really great resources, including Dr. Don's books. He has one on history and one on blending that he just released this past fall. So really great resources from his perspective and his point of view and being a blender.
And as Gina mentioned, yes, we did talk about this earlier. And I mentioned no one go out and order any right now, because there could be something happening down the line. So, yes.
The secret is you're not going to need them, because during this workshop tomorrow, you're going to do a brain melting exercise with Dr. Don, and you know everything that he knows. And we're all going to celebrate with Space Barrel Whiskey.
Yep.
Space Barrel Whiskey.
Space Barrel Whiskey. Space Force. Space Barrel Whiskey. This is great.
I feel bad because Dr. Don's such a lovely person, and I've fully set him up for disaster. But, if we're talking about whiskey, you might as well be having a little fun, too. So if you're not a part of the certification program and you want to acquire one of the books, absolutely highly recommend. Dr. Don's one of the smartest people alive. But if you're in the certification program, wait for the brain melting exercise before you start ordering things. And with that, I think we will save some of the other questions for Dr. Don, Dave, and Gina for tomorrow. And we're gonna do our standard outro. Make sure we wrap this thing up nice, like we do with all of our episodes, as soon as this document scrolls up and I remember what I'm supposed to say. Perfect. So if you enjoyed this class, please smash that like or love button and show some love in the comments. If you want to see more classes like this, for instance, the one pretty similar to this that we have next week, because it's a part of the Canadian Whiskey Certification Series, you can follow Camp Run Amok on Facebook. You can follow Portland Cocktail Week on Facebook. You can head over to the Portland Cocktail Week YouTube channel. Go ahead and subscribe. Go through, watch some videos, give those a little thumbs up. We love that. And we're also at Camp Run Amok on Instagram. You can always find out what we're going to be up to next there. And before I tell Dave and Gina, thank you so much for today, I want to remind you to join us next week for the final class for now in our Canadian whiskey journey, where Gina and Dave are going to go Mythbusters on 2 iconic Canadian whiskey categories, blended whiskeys and rye whiskeys. So Dave, Gina, thank you for the time today. Looking forward to next week. And everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.